Good morning. I'm Malcolm Clemens Young, Dean of Grace Cathedral. Welcome to the Fall Forum season. Bill Gates once said, "You realize I could spend $3 million a day, every day, for the next 100 years, and that's if I don't make another dime." What is it like to have such riches in this era of stark political divisions and near-Dickensian economic differences? How mind-boggling are the opportunities and access? How problematic the downsides? Does one's experience differ depending on whether the money is made or inherited, whether you're male or female, white or black? Does being a have among the have-nots make someone a bad person? And does the peculiarly American fantasy of hitting the jackpot explain how we got to the point where nearly half of Americans have no wealth at all? My guest today is Michael Mechanic, a longtime senior editor and writer at Mother Jones magazine. His first book, Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All, is the product of deep reporting and dozens of interviews with fortunate citizens, company founders and executives, superstar coders, investors, inheritors, athletes, wealth and philanthropy professionals, luxury realtors, and even a person who trains billionaires' nannies in physical combat. Today, we're going to be talking about his troubling journey into the American wealth fantasy and where it has taken us. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I've been deep in your book, and I enjoyed reading it very much. It's just such an indictment of where we've come to be as a society, and there's such a tragedy too for the individual stories of what wealth is meant for people who have it, and what wealth means for people who don't have it too.
It can be it's a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah, it really can be.
On both ends.
Yeah, exactly. That's why being in the middle, that vanishing middle, is such a delightful place to be.
Yeah, I would say the upper middle class is the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Where you don't have to worry about, your credit card bill, and you also don't have to worry about the responsibilities of great wealth, which can be really mess up a family.
Yeah. Well, I literally don't buy lottery tickets because I'm like, I can't deal with it. If I became wealthy, so I love what I'm doing so much. I want to focus all my energies on that. I wouldn't even want to have that as a distraction.
Well, you're among the half of Americans who don't buy lottery tickets.
I know.
So Gallup polls people periodically about their buying of lottery tickets, and half of American adults invariably have bought one within the last 30 days, I think it is.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a funny story. Like when I was, you write your book proposal and your agent sends it to the publishing houses, and you get a bunch of them who are interested. And so I said, hey, I want to fly out to New York and sit down with the publishers when you meet with them. And he said, sure, come on. And so it happened that week, the Powerball, I think one of the big lotteries, was up to $1.5 billion. And so I get to New York, I went to a dime store and bought a whole bunch of lottery tickets. And then I handed them out to all the publishers.
Oh, it's a great idea. They'll all remember you.
And so, I bought a couple too, right? And I remember not being able to sleep the night before the drawing because I was just thinking, what if I won?
Yeah.
I mean, you got to think it through. What would it actually do to you? It would completely upend your life. And we fantasize about all the good things, all the ease and the financial security and the cool things we could do, and we could help our friends and neighbors, and we could go on crazy trips and do all this stuff. But you don't think about how it becomes your albatross too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I couldn't deal with it right now. I would have to be retired before I could win the lottery.
I was relieved, right? I was relieved I didn't win.
Yeah, exactly.
I once won $10 in a lottery.
Yeah. I wonder if you could tell me just like how you first got this idea, to study these people who've been so financially successful. Whether through inheritance or through what they've done.
I think it kind of goes way back, right? I was born and raised in Madison, Wisconsin, and we lived right by a park. And we were, technically, you'd call us upper middle class, but my mom grew up in the Depression. She was very frugal. I only ever got secondhand clothes. We had one, Dodge Dart.
We had a Dodge Dart too.
I love the old Dodge Dart,
me
right?
too. That's how I learned to drive. We had one Dodge Dart in our house, a bit dark green.
But, I'd never had to worry where a meal was coming from. I didn't have to worry about any physical needs I was taken care of. Unlike, a lot of people in this country do have to worry about this thing. So I was privileged and I didn't realize it, right?
Yeah.
I felt like, I never get any new stuff. I don't have any cool toys. Never, I don't. But I didn't really care because I was a dirty kid. I would scrap around in the garden and get dirty in the woods and collect bugs and whatever, whatever kids do. And I would go into the park and there would be these old guys with the metal detectors.
Right.
And I would follow them around. The same, I would go up to people who were fishing. What do you got? What did you catch? And the metal guy, I would say, what did you find? Did you find treasure? I mean, I was obsessed with this idea of finding something really valuable. It was just kind of a cool thing for, kids are into pirates, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So that's just some background. I went on, I studied biochemistry in college, and I got a job after, I somehow always managed to graduate into a recession. And there just weren't jobs in the area I was looking. So I eventually did get a job, sort of the last resume I sent out at this sort of very scrappy company that sold antibodies to researchers.
Yeah.
And it was a good experience, but the pay was terrible. It was in South San Francisco. I was commuting from Berkeley, a long drive, soul-sucking. And I started, this is terrible. I'll start buying lottery tickets. Maybe I'll win and I won't have to do this, right?
Yeah.
And, of course, I didn't win. Later on, I went to grad school in also cellular and developmental biology and ended up dropping out of a PhD program, coming back to Berkeley, going to the journalism school at Berkeley, and thinking I would be a science writer.
Yeah.
I became a much more generalist writer.
Right.
But then during the dot-com boom, I was working for this magazine called The Industry Standard. You may remember it. It went off the cliff when the dot-com boom busted. But at the time, it was flying high. It was actually the most successful magazine in history at that time because it just... Wow. All of these tech companies just buying ads like crazy. That would get fatter and fatter. Then there would be spin-off magazines and all this stuff. And so I was getting paid pretty well for a journalist, for a young journalist. But even so, you would see these young guys around you. Hey, that guy just sold his stock options and he made $7 million. And you'd be like, whoa. Yeah. So I started, on a walk to work, I started buying the lottery ticket again. Yeah. And then so sometime later, when the whole thing had gone south, I started thinking about what would really happen if you came into that kind of money. And I thought a kind of a cool idea for a book would be to find people to whom it really happened. And the book would be called Jackpot, same.
Yeah.
But it would be about lottery winners, and each chapter would be about a different lottery winner.
Yeah, I actually had a friend who was writing a short story about a guy who basically would go and announce to people that they'd won the lottery. But yeah, I can totally imagine each book would be...
But they hadn't won the lottery?
They hadn't, no, still.
Oh, that's actually, there's something in my book that you could relate to about that.
Yeah. But I love that idea. So you'd have like some people who like it was a great thing in their life, and other people it was just like led to total despair. And each
we hear the horror stories, right? You all heard the lottery horror stories. This guy wins $300 million, and all of a sudden, his kids are doing this, and he's carrying bags of cash to a strip club. And I mean, this is real, actually. That's a real example. And then his daughter kills herself, or his granddaughter kills. I mean, these families just go.
Yeah.
But then, those are the ones we hear about. Then there's the ones we don't hear about. And I wanted to understand more about what happens to these guys. So there's a guy named Jason Kurland who he calls himself the lottery lawyer. He had represented like several dozen lottery winners, including, it turned out, the woman who won the $1.5 billion lottery. And he said, well, half of my clients kind of go crazy and do that crazy spending thing, and about half of them just don't know what to do. They're frozen, and they don't even want to take advantage of anything, and they don't want to quit their, $12 an hour job because they don't want to change anything. And he tries to encourage them. Well, you actually can change your life in some way.
I like that you describe him and giving him almost like a budget. Like you could spend such to such and such, or you could buy this thing, but don't go crazy. But
right. So those are the people we don't hear. So I was just interested in, could you track those people down? And the fact is you can't. They won't talk to you because when you win the lottery, you come under siege, and all of a sudden everybody wants a piece of you.
Yeah.
You have to move. You have to, even if you didn't want to move, if you want to stay in your neighborhood, forget it, Your old friends, maybe you see them, maybe you don't. You got to buy yourself a compound somewhere.
Yeah.
And so you have the financial security, but you lose the community. And then people are, financial planners are coming at you. If you have a lot of experience in the finance world, you could probably swing it.
Yeah.
But if you're unsophisticated that way, it's very easy for you to be taken advantage of. And it turns out our lottery lawyer later, so I had interviewed him a couple times, and there's this whole section of the book where I talked to him, and then I see this thing, Jason Curlin indicted for stealing from his clients, like $100 million from his clients. And I was like, oh, it was, with mob connections and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do with it? Can I keep him in my book now?
Right.
So what I did is sort of, this is a spoiler, I'm sorry. Because I kind of set it up. I do the whole thing, and then later on when I talk about some of the problems people face, said, by the way, our lottery lawyer is on trial.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I was pretty shocked. So tell me about the difference between people who are the top 10%, the top 5%, the top 1%, and the top 0.01%. Like, how are their lives different from each other and from us?
Well, I said this in the book, and you guys can probably all relate, right? When you're a kid, you heard the term millionaire. I mean, we still do it. We still talk about millionaires.
I know, it's true.
Millionaires are a dime a dozen. There's millions, tens of millions of millionaires in the United States. In fact, most of the people in this room, if you own a house, you're a millionaire.
Yeah.
In the Bay Area.
I'm not a millionaire, but
You don't know
all the people around me are.
Well, you buy a house for a few $100,000. 10 years later, it's worth 1.5 million.
Yeah,
That's the way it is in the Bay Area. So you're a millionaire in your house.
Yeah.
You're not a millionaire in your life.
Right.
I mean, you could sell the house, but where are you going to live in the Bay Area? You'd have to move to Nebraska, right? So the geography has a lot to do with it. People make 400 grand here, and they go, "Oh, I'm middle class."
Yeah.
It's like, really?
Yeah.
Let's talk to the real middle class people and see what they think of that.
Yeah, completely.
So where were we? Sorry.
So the 10%. What does that look like? 5%.
Okay, so the threshold numbers are sort of hard to get, so I didn't update them because I had to go back and forth with these economists to get them. But this is the 2019 numbers, and just figure they've gone up from there. To even get into the top 10% by wealth, you have to have at least 1.1 million. To get into the top 5%, you need, I think, at least 1.9. And the averages are much higher. This is just the bare minimum. Or, as far as like money, you need...
Like income.
Yeah,
So
I can't remember the exact
Yeah.
numbers for income.
Yeah.
But it's high. It's like, 450,000 a year.
Yeah.
Something like that. And then you get to the 1%, and I think at that time, just the bare minimum was 5.6 million to be the bottom end of the 1%. But again, the way wealth is skewed in this country, averages are much higher. Like the average of the 1% was something like 20 million.
Yeah.
And then if you start going up the scale, it's just like this.
Yeah.
In fact, one thing that's interesting is like if you chart average household wealth by wealth percentile, it looks like this. Yeah. It goes exponential at the top end of the curve. Yeah. So you get up to the 90 to 100%, it just goes skyrockets. Now then, if you take the top 1% and you start the chart all over, and you start with the 1%, and do it by point, what would it be like 99.1, 99.2. The chart looks the same.
Yeah, funny, interesting.
Because the people, even within the 1%, there's massive wealth disparities.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And what that tells you is how much advantage it is to have wealth already.
Yeah.
How the system is set up in a way that wealth begets wealth. And wealth is rewarded, and if you have nothing, you get nothing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I had a wedding yesterday in the wine country. So, all I'm thinking about is jackpot, jackpot everywhere I look. And yeah, I mean, if you're already wealthy, one of the things you say, you just get a lot of free things.
Right.
And so things that poor people have to pay for are, like having friends in Napa Valley, like the dinner I had last night, like, all that. It just seems so unfair. And those are just like the surface level things.
Right, there's social things, experiences,
Yeah.
connections, social connections. If you're starting a business, hey, can you help me out? Can you invest in my business?
Yeah.
Can you help me get a loan? I mean, these things are huge. Like the access to capital is a big disparity, right? If you don't grow up or you're not surrounded by people in that milieu, it's really hard to get money to start a business, for example.
Yeah.
And women have had the same problem, incidentally, for ages. It's much harder for women to raise money to start a business because most of the people controlling the money flow are men.
Yeah.
And they hold women to a higher standard. You have to perform better. You have to, pass a much bigger checklist before they're going to give you the money.
Well,
so
even when you're talking about just like regulations that prevent like ordinary Americans from making high-risk investments,
Right.
Those regulations will limit what kind of investment income they can.
That's the difference between the 10% and the 5%.
Yeah.
There's something called an accredited investor. And to be an accredited investor, you either need, I think, income of $300,000 a year for a couple of years running, or you need $1 million free and clear of your house. So you need $1 million that you can invest. The government doesn't let you invest in private transactions unless you have that $1 million.
Yeah.
So private equity, real estate, development deals, all these things. If I'm a VC guy and I'm trying to raise money, first of all, I'm not going to touch you if you have $1 million because I want 100
Right.
million or a billion, right? But even theoretically, I couldn't let you in unless you have that $1 million to start with. You can't put $25,000 in if you're a mere millionaire.
Right, right. One of the things that I think a lot about is just like the tax system too. And I wonder if you can talk about that, just how that leads to that vast inequalities in terms of wealth.
Well, if you looked at our tax system, we have a progressive income tax. The other taxes like property taxes, sales taxes, those are called regressive taxes because the more money you have, the less they affect you. Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, in their book called The Triumph of Injustice, calculated that the least wealthy 10% of people spend 10 cents out of every dollar on sales taxes. It's about a penny or two for the 1%.
Yeah.
Because the things that are taxed are like common goods that we need to buy every day. Things like legal services and financial services and purchases of big ticket items like boats and cars and yachts, these things, the taxes are low on them. In fact, I have in the book, South Carolina caps taxes of luxury items at $500. Wow. So I put in the book, you can buy a little bass boat and you're going to pay, tax on that. You can buy a mega yacht. You don't buy it in South Carolina, I guess. Maybe you do, I don't know. But you can buy a Gulfstream jet and you pay $500 in tax.
Yeah.
It's just this huge giveaway.
Huge giveaway. So
it's getting back. The reason we have a progressive tax, and actually a lot of conservatives want it to be a flat tax, and the problem with that is once you go to the progressive tax is kind of a corrective of the regressive taxes. It helps even out the total taxes you pay. But if you make that a flat tax, as some states have done, and some people in Congress are advocating for, then the whole system becomes even more regressive.
Yeah.
Meaning the less you have, the greater proportion of your income
goes to taxes, exactly. And why do you think Americans are okay with that? Like, why do you think, these new tax bills that reduce the tax burden of very wealthy people, why do Americans continue to enact these bills?
Americans don't.
Yeah.
Congress does. And that's a big difference because if most Americans, if you survey, including Republicans, think billionaires should be taxed more, right?
Yeah.
But they never can get these bills through. A bunch of them have failed in the past, 2 years.
Yeah.
And the reason is because the people in Congress, where do you think they get their money? From those billionaires. I mean, look at, okay, so, and it's both sides of the aisle, right?
Yeah.
In this election, you know, when they were trying to get Biden to step down.
Right.
There were all these articles, and you know, there was no analysis of it. But as I'm reading the New York Times, it's like, oh well, these donors are putting pressure on, you know, these donors, and we're talking about the billionaires.
Yeah.
And they have a voice in this. They get to call the shots. We don't get to call the shots.
Yeah.
Well, you know, maybe we like that, whatever. But maybe we want Harris. Maybe we want someone else. But it's those billionaires who are forcing the decisions. Yeah. And the articles sort of just take it for granted that these are the people with the clout. And they do. They are the people with the clout. I mean, in the book, I talk about studies of sort of the political influence of very wealthy people versus the public. And the political priorities, it turns out, I mean, first of all, I'll just say, any of these studies, it's hard to find very wealthy people to talk to you. Researchers have this. I had the same problem with my book, right? I got so many rejections. Sociologists study this stuff. They get so many rejections. Finally, you know, you get what you get. But these researchers work really hard. Finally, they'll get like 80 or 100 families to talk to them. And it turns out that the priorities, even Democrat or Republican, the priorities are very different from public priorities. Yeah. And these people call their Congress people, they call their senators, they call regulators. They reach out like at a far greater rate than the public does, because they know they'll be listened to and that people will call them back. And so, for instance, here's education, for instance, public education. The support for more money to bolster the public education system is very popular among just in public surveys. Yeah. It's about 35% in the very wealthy. And that's because their kids don't go to public school.
They don't, you're right. So they've opted out. They are.
I mean, there are wealthy progressives who heart is in the right place and they say the right things and they believe the right things. But I say, you know, wealth is almost like its own political constituency. Yeah. It's almost beyond party. I mean, yeah, there's different ideological differences, but when it comes to sort of protecting certain self-interests, it matters how much money you have.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's interesting. So what you have is just like radical inequality, and then that inequality drives the policy making, and that policy making protects and expands that inequality.
Right.
So, like,
there's this terrible vicious cycle, right?
It's a vicious cycle.
And sort of the more money that the very wealthy are able to sort of milk out of the system, I mean, and there's just been a lot, it started in the 80s with the Reagan tax cuts. Yeah. And you just see if you look at sort of household wealth over time, you just see the top break out from the pack in those years, and then the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, and it's just it's pretty. Can I read you some stats?
Yeah,
I mean, I don't. You know, I wrote them down because I can't remember all the numbers.
I'm so glad you did that.
I just want to read you a few.
Raise the quality of our discussion.
Okay, right now, the 25,000 richest Americans have more wealth than the poorest 125 million, and not only that, they have 12.5 times more wealth than the collective wealth of 125 million people. In 1979. Income disparity between the top 1% and the bottom 90% in income, not wealth, was 12 to 1. It's now 42 to 1. In October 1984, so that's 40 years ago, the less wealthy 90% of the population owned 37% of the nation's wealth, and the richest owned 24%. Now the richest own 37%, and the bottom 90 share has dropped 9 percentage points to 28%. No, I don't want to make your eyes glaze over, but there's a million stats like this. They're just like, what? How did this happen, right? How did the share of the national wealth get sucked up to the top like this? And it's all policy.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think about just Donald Trump as being like such a popular figure and such an influential figure, and I wonder how he's connected to just, you know, the kinds of stories that you tell in Jackpot, and just how Americans understand wealth.
I avoided talking about Trump in the book.
Yeah, I noticed that. I think that was wise. I think it just can be such a lightning rod. It's almost like you said, it's like the wealthy are their own political party, and this would have distracted from that. But
I mean,
I'm
Trump is just a
about
symptom.
Yeah.
Right. He says what he says. He says anything he can to hold on to power and get power and get admiration from a certain crowd. He just went out. He was on camera at some fundraiser, very wealthy donors, saying, fairly recently, he said, "I'm going to give you a tax cut." Well, it's like, what? Another tax cut?
Yeah.
Do they need another tax cut? The crowd is cheering.
Yeah.
I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I mean, they have every advantage in the world right now. And I mean, the gap, and the gap, I talked to this guy who's, interestingly, he's probably a billionaire by now, but he wasn't when I interviewed him, Nick Hanauer, who's kind of an anti-inequality crusader. At the same time, the guy has 2 yachts, like 5 homes. I mean, he's very, very, he lives the lifestyle, but his whole shtick is like, I'm the plutocrat that talks to my own people and tries to get them to change their minds, on these things. And, his argument is bad for everybody to have wealth.
Right, completely, so concentrated.
Because if you lose if the middle class can't afford the products you're selling, you're not going to sell the products, right?
Yeah. I think of Donald Trump as being a symptom of both like our desire for that like wealthy, famous person, our desire to like be like that person, and then also living in a universe where, like you said, 50% of Americans like have nothing, have no wealth.
When we talk about the economy being good or not good, we're talking usually about the top half.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't think, when we talk about economic indicators and the stock market and all these things, this is great, but we're not looking at the, half of the population. And half of the population tends to be struggling. I mean, on average, and then the further you go down, it just gets ridiculous, right? Let me tell you about an experiment that was, there was a paper in 2011 by a couple of researchers, Dan Ariely and Michael Norton at Harvard Business School. They wanted to see what the Americans' perception of inequality were. And so there were 2 sections to it. The first one, they made a bunch of pie charts showing wealth distributions of the 5 quintiles, 5 20% quintiles. And they said, here's one that's every 20% gets 20% of the wealth.
Right. So
and here's one, perfect equality, right? And then here's one where it's like, 11, 15, 18, 30, 40 or something. It was something in the middle. And that, they actually used the Sweden's distribution.
Yeah.
And then they did one with the US distribution, and they would show them pairs, where would you rather live? And people didn't want perfect equality. I mean, and that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not fair. Perfect equality, we think, that's so fair. No, it's not fair because, the guy who sweeps the floor at night, do they deserve the same salary as the CEO? No, come on.
Yeah.
But how much more does the CEO get than the guy who sweeps the floor?
Yeah.
At what point does the CEO...
4 times as much, 10 times as much.
The top, here's another stat for you that I remember. The top 350 public corporations, you look at the CEO versus the average worker. In 1979, it was, I think, 21x the income. Now it's 350 to 1. So what does that mean when the workers, the CEOs are getting all the money, the investors are getting all the money, the workers are not progressing?
Yeah.
What also happens is there's a social divide there. Okay, so back in the 60s or whatever, you might have the CEO living down the street from you.
Right.
And you're in a middle-class neighborhood. I mean, I remember my neighborhood, there was like very rich doctor down the street. Like they had the basketball court and all that. We played with their kids. There was mixing. There were these mixed wealth areas. What we have now is I call it wealth flight. Income segregation is what the sociologists call it, where the rich flee middle-income areas to wealth havens where everyone is kind of in the same realm.
Yeah.
And the poor get stuck in the worst parts of a town, and you end up with these shrinking middle-class areas.
Yeah.
And, what happens is in those areas, when you start seeing more income segregation, you get less social mobility because there's no mixing.
Right.
You don't have the chance to meet people that are not in your bubble.
Yeah.
That's what I call the bubbles. These rich communities is the bubble. You're in there, and all of a sudden, private equity, the private jet flights, the house in Aspen, it all starts to sound normal to you.
Yeah.
But it's so not normal.
No.
It's really bizarre, really.
Yeah.
Oh, we're just going to fly down to Florida. And,
Yeah, I know, that's so weird to me. So tell me, what are some things that the very rich don't know about ordinary people, and some things that ordinary people don't know about the very rich people?
Well, wait, I need to finish telling you about the experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so they did rich and poor, Americans, Democrats, Republicans, 92%, they all chose Sweden.
Sweden, yeah.
They all chose Sweden because they looked at the American distribution. They're like, no way.
Yeah.
The second part of the experiment was even more interesting, and I had to write down the numbers here. Okay, so they said, I want you, first of all, to guess what you think the real wealth distribution is in the United States. What does each 20% own in terms of the national wealth? And then tell me what you think is fair. If you had to divvy it up, what would be ideal?
Yeah.
Okay, so they did this for the top 20%, and then they did it for the bottom 40. So they said, okay, the top 20%. So people guessed top 20% own 59% of the wealth. They said, if to be fair, it would be 32%. The actual at the time was 84%.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so the bottom 40%, they greatly overestimated the wealth of the bottom 40. They guessed, the bottom 40 has 9% of the wealth. To be fair, it would be 24%.
Yeah.
It was 0.3%.
Yeah.
0.3. And actually, since then, it's gone to nothing. It's zero. The bottom 40% of the population has no wealth at all. Yeah. Zero. Yeah. And why is that? Because about the bottom quarter is in debt. They have negative wealth.
Exactly. Yeah, negative debt. Yeah. Yeah, so back to my question.
I mean, we're the richest country in the world.
I know, and we live with such terrible poverty. Yeah, and it affects every other thing. I'm talking about marriage and divorce in the sermon today, and it's.
I have a whole chapter.
It's deeply correlated. Exactly.
It's called the marriage premium.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you're right. So tell me a little bit about. We were talking about just like those bubbles. Mm-hmm. So what's the difference in terms of perception of like very wealthy people, because they don't know what it's like to be ordinary, and what is the ordinary people's perspective of the very wealthy?
I think the ordinary people think the very wealthy are kind of clueless,
yeah,
especially about what they're going through.
Yeah,
and I think they are. There's sort of a tendency among wealthy people to look at people who haven't been successful and think, they're not successful because they're not putting in the effort. I mean, polls show this,
yeah.
But it's not just very wealthy people; it's also middle class people. Polls say, there's a tendency as you have more money to feel more deserving of that money, which is sort of strange. I mean, there's obviously, these are all sort of averages, and there's obviously people who say, no, I was lucky, I was super lucky, I was in the right place at the right time, I had the education, and I grabbed it, whatever. Yeah. But then there's also a lot of deservingness. Oh, I made this, I'm biologically superior. You still see social Darwinism here.
Gosh, yeah.
I mean, I had people say this to me, it's like, I think there's a genetic aspect to this. And it's like, really?
Yeah.
Really? I mean, the fact is that your chance of success is very much tied to your parents' income.
Yeah.
We fetishize rags to riches stories in America.
Yeah.
They are few and far between, but we hear about them, we write it. That's the thing. They're fun stories to read, they're fun stories to write, and they get blown up. And so I talked to a guy who was truly rags to riches and became the head of the Ford Foundation,
right, I remember that. Yeah.
Darren Walker.
Darren Walker.
I think he just stepped down, actually, just like the other week. But he grew up, he's a black guy, he grew up in a tiny town in Texas, no paved roads, shotgun shack kind of rental property. And the people would come around to the house and yell at his mom in front of the kids.
Right, 'cause they're not paying their bills.
You haven't paid the bill. And so, he was just, he was a real go-getter, and he just, worked every angle.
Yeah, went to law school.
He got into the University of Texas,
yeah.
And then he made his way into this thing called the Friars Club, which was this elite club where they had governors and business people and
abbots.
famous alumni. Yeah, and he became the abbot, which is like the head of the club. And so he told me he would go to these club functions and he would say, "Hi, I'm Darren." They'd be like, "Can you get me a gin and tonic?"
Yeah, right.
And he'd be like, "Okay."
Yeah.
Actually, I'm the head of this organization.
Yeah.
So yeah, what he said is, this guy now, as the head of the Ford Foundation, he dealt with all these billionaire people, because all these very, very, very fancy functions. And he said, I hear so often from these very wealthy white people, "Oh, I look to you as an inspiration, and you were able to do this, and you're this glowing example." But it's like, it's not that easy. It's not like you can just do that. He was smart, and he had go get them, but he also got very lucky. And very few people can do that. There's very little social mobility, and much of it depends on education, higher education.
Yeah. When I was a graduate student, I lived in Horatio Alger's old dorm room.
Oh. At Harvard?
At Harvard, yeah.
Okay, so I was going to say, Horatio Alger, the rags to riches.
19th century.
Yeah, it's 150 years ago. The book was called Ragged Dick.
Ragged Dick.
Ragged Dick was like a shoe shine boy.
Yeah, exactly.
And
worked his way up.
He had grit and determination. And this was a huge bestseller. It was serialized, and then it came out as a novel. And America was smitten with Ragged Dick and Horatio Alger. And you talk about the Horatio Alger story. That's like the person who worked hard to make good. And this has become a huge American myth. And then there was James Truslow Adams, who wrote the book that coined the term the American dream. Well, Adams worked on Wall Street. Horatio Alger went to Harvard. And de Tocqueville, who went around saying, "Oh, there's no class in America." He was an aristocrat. I mean, we're seeing things through this lens of, very wealthy people. And, that myth is still with us. Think of the Paul Ryan era. The makers and the takers. These people are lazy. They're on the dole. They're lazy. It's like, no, it's actually they're working at Amazon, and they have to go on the public dole because they don't get paid enough just to live. I mean, rents are pretty high.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about living in America. That story, that fiction, is much more powerful than that reality. And
well, you talked about why we don't step up and protest. I would say there's two things. One is we still believe in this myth. And we say, "Oh, they're not really trying if they can't pull their weight," right? I lost my track of thought. Sorry.
Yeah. No. It's that myth that has more powerful than the reality. It does stop us from, like, really. I guess we also get kind of helpless too. I mean, when you have zero wealth, you're.
Well, I remember the other part.
Yeah, I figured you would.
Well, the other part is we just don't pay attention.
Yeah.
If you're not in it, if you're not in the living, scraping from paycheck to paycheck, in which case you're not thinking about much else. If you're doing well, you're still, you have a busy life, your kids, your job, you need some downtime. You're not sitting around thinking about your neighbors. You're not thinking about inequality generally. And the interesting thing about the Norton Ariely experiment, it came out in 2011. The numbers were actually from 2001. I talked to Norton about it. And it just took a long time to get into print. But 2011 was when we had Occupy.
Right.
And it's when Joseph Stiglitz wrote a piece in Vanity Fair that talked about the 1%. And all of a sudden, everyone's talking about the 1% and the 99%. We weren't talking about that before 2011. It seems like forever, but it's true. It's like, boom, and it became a big issue in the 2012 election. You remember the Mitt Romney, the 47%, which Mother Jones broke. Might have been the nail in Romney's coffin. Because people were really worked up at that time about it. Well, I asked Norton, I said, look, we've had all this time of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren out on the stump saying, to be a billionaire, it means we have an immoral society, all these things here, and quoting stats and this and that. And I said, what if you did your experiment now? And he said, I think it would be the same. And lo and behold, he has repeated his experiment. It's not in print yet, but he told me it's basically the same result. A decade of railing against wealth inequality, and most people just aren't paying attention.
it hasn't made a difference.
I mean, I'm just dumbfounded, actually. I'm a journalist. I'm in the middle of this political bubble, and I read everything, and I just feel like, who are these undecided voters? I mean, all these, people don't know what the Inflation Reduction Act is, or what it did, or the fact that there's even all this money going into clean energy. They just don't. I'm like, do you read anything at all?
Yeah.
Are you just blissfully unaware?
Yeah, completely. But you're right too. People just barely making it by. One of the traditions we have on our program is we take questions from our audience. So I'm going to invite everybody to write down their questions.
I do want to make a point, though.
Yeah.
It makes it sound, I think we're making it a little bit sound like this book is just railing against the rich. It's not.
No. You have a wonderful sympathy for the people that you're with. That's what I think.
The New York Times thought I was too empathetic.
I thought you were wonderfully empathetic in a way that humanizes this.
Yeah. Because we haven't talked a lot about the problems that wealth brings to families.
That's what I was going to ask you. Like, so tell us a little bit what your experience has been with people who have won the jackpot, either through their business or through an inheritance or through the actual lottery.
It's a mixed bag for them, and it depends. Especially the people who've worked really hard to get to a point, and then they sell their business or they cash out in some way. See, we don't call it the jackpot, we call it the exit.
Right.
The exit from, you sell the company that you started a long time ago. Well, some people, they're very well off. They're free to do what they want, but there's a lot of sort of existential angst, first of all, in now what do I do? What's meaningful to me? I don't have to work anymore. There's not that force in my life that gives me the impetus to do anything in particular. So that can be very challenging for people, but it's more than that. I talked to a guy who had sold a company he started and taken about $40 million out of the deal. And he said, when you go from creating wealth to just sitting on it, when you cash in, all of a sudden your whole focus shifts to protecting it and being worried you're going to lose it. Yeah. He said, I'm fear-based now. Yeah. He's always thinking about, I talk about this, you're always thinking about money when you have that much money. Yeah. And if you have the more money you have, is more money, more problems, right? I talked to this guy, Richard Watts. He was a great source. He's a consigliere for some of the richest families in America. He hangs out with these people with yachts, with helicopters and crews of 14 and building houses in the islands and whatever. Yeah. And they're very lonely, isolated people. Yeah. And they bring their problems to him, and it's like, wow, everyone in my family wants something from me. My kids, they just see me as a piggy bank. Yeah. I don't know what to do. I don't feel like I have any real friends. I mean, it's really a problem with your perception of self, your perception of others, your trust of others. Relationships really suffer in very wealthy families. I mean, some of you might have seen Succession. It's not far off. A lot of, especially the kids in these families, are lost, right? Yeah. They don't have anywhere to fall and to learn and to feel like they've done something on their own. Everything is just, we're going to hold you up to the light bulb so you can screw it in, right?
Yeah, and then just the effort to make sure that they inherit vast amounts too. I didn't really understand that, why wealthy people are trying to have their children inherit so much. And does it mean that they really believe that having that wealth is going to be good for their children in the long run?
Andrew Carnegie would call it vanity, family pride. He said this is the only, he would say giving the almighty dollar to your son is a curse. Yeah. That's the way he said it. It's a curse. Yeah. And it is a curse. Because, I mean, yeah, you don't have to struggle, but you struggle existentially, you struggle psychologically. Yeah. And I mean, there's a whole, I don't want to get into it, but there's a whole section, a part of my book where I talk about the psychology of wealth and materialism and all these people who have studied it. It's fascinating stuff. And it turns out that there's a lot of similarities between the richest and the poorest in terms of sort of social problems for different reasons, but antisocial behaviors, we look at poverty as the we pathologize poverty and say, oh, all these problems come out of poverty. Well, they come out of great wealth too. We just don't see it because those kids are protected.
Yeah, that's really true. And I even just think there must be some like level too, like, some, so that you're just giving them everything just seems like it's just so damaging to them.
Yeah, well, some wealthy people do say, I'm gonna give all my money away, and I'm gonna give. Well, I'll just give the kids $5 million, right? You know what you can give your kids right now? $27 million without paying a dime of tax.
Yeah, that's what's like.
Now that's a problem.
Yeah, it's a problem.
And it's going to reset at the end of next year.
Yeah.
But we'll see what Congress is going to do about it. It's going to reset to half that, but it's still, whatever, 14 million, 13 million.
Yeah,
it's a lot of money to just give to a kid. I mean, think about taking away your agency. Yeah, sure. If you are really driven to start a particular business or a nonprofit and you want to use that money for that, I mean, you can do good things with it. But a lot of people can be rudderless and face a lot of problems because of it.
Yeah, and then the next generation after that is going to.
It can wipe out families.
Yeah,
it really can. Yeah. Even at modest wealth, some of it depends on where you grew up. If you grew up in the bubble and everybody's rich, it's like maybe that's where the money gets passed along, and it maybe has a little less of a corrosive effect. If those kids know, if those kids live among people ever with less wealth,
thank you.
They're going to feel really conflicted about it.
Yeah,
being handed a lot of money.
Yeah, that's really true. So here are some questions. What needs to be passed in Congress to redistribute or narrow the gap between the wealthy and the middle class? Be specific.
Well, you have to be able to figure out a way to tax wealth at the very high end because it's gotten so out of control, and that's tricky because we're talking about 100 million and up, really, because so much of the national wealth has gone that way, and it's just corrosive to society. It really is, and it's corrosive to democracy, the political. Because, like I said, the billionaires control the process. It's hard to tax them because the only way to tax billionaires is to tax unrealized wealth, meaning assets that haven't been sold, and we kind of see that in this country as what? You haven't even made the profit yet, and we're taxing you on it. But what the billionaires do is they don't ever sell, and they just borrow against that money for a few percent, right? And so instead of paying whatever 20% capital gains rate, they're paying 3% interest. And so they don't pay income tax. And so they're escaping from the progressive tax that we do have. So you got to get to a way to do that. You also have to stop the intergenerational wealth transfer. We shouldn't have dynasties in this country. We have a growing number of them, and those dynasties are very powerful. I've asked a lot of people I know, what a family office is? And very few do. Raise your hand. Do you know what a family office is?
Well,
you are smart people. Lawyers tend to know. Like friends of mine who are lawyers know. People who have been around wealth know. But most people have never heard of this. And it's basically a LLC that a very wealthy family sets up just to manage its family affairs and its family wealth. It's like a private bank, essentially, for one family, or sometimes a few families. And they also have special carve-outs in the laws about what they need to disclose and the way they're taxed and things like that. So back to the taxation, we have to curb what's something called a grantor retained annuity trust. We have to kill these things because they are a weird method by which a billionaire can pass unbelievable sums to their offspring without paying a dime. And something like half the wealthiest families in the U.S., ProPublica reported, use this kind of trust now. And it was created by accident. Congress was trying to fix one problem, they opened doors to another. I talked to the guy who invented this type of trust. It's called his client was Audrey Walton, the sister-in-law. And she was she wanted to leave hundreds of millions to her kids and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, the IRS challenged them. He's the one who got the law changed, essentially, to make these things tax-free. And so, Zuckerberg, Sheldon Adelson, they billions of dollars to their offspring.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is almost like a kind of arms race where the team of lawyers and accountants are thinking of new policies and new loopholes, and the public servants
So
can't
that's the
keep
trouble.
up.
Even when you have very wealthy people whose heart is in the right place, and they go out and they write op-eds and they join groups to say, we want to change tax policy to make things fairer. Well, a lot of them hire banks and wealth managers. Those wealth managers are part of a giant industry that is lobbying the other way.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so
so
even if you're doing the right thing, over here, those people are lobbying Congress to keep those rules the way they are.
Yeah. Okay, how is private equity contributing to the rise in wealth inequality? Can we stop this? Private equity is buying up and ruining so many things we need: nursing homes, childcare, veterinary, et cetera.
Yes. Well, I think the way you address private equity is by reducing the amount of money floating around higher up. When you have too much money to invest, it starts to find bad things. I mean, one thing that drives me crazy is private equity buying up all this residential housing and then renting it back to people. They wait till there's a calamity, prices drop, they just buy whole neighborhoods, and then jack up the rents.
Yeah.
And people are always going to find bad things to invest in if they think it's going to make them a buck. And I would hope they don't. But the best way to address it, I think there are, I don't have a specific policy because I haven't studied that closely, but there probably are ways to rein in the private equity partners. But one thing is to get rid of carried interest, which makes them incredibly richer.
Yeah.
Carried interest is essentially the way the private equity works is they get institutional investor comes in, we got $100 million, okay, we're going to take it for 5 years, we're going to guarantee you 8% return. Anything above that, we split 80-20, so then the managers get the 20%. And these things make a lot of money, and they rake in the cash. So they've swung this deal so they can take that 20% and treat it not as investment profits, or treat it as investment profits rather than income.
Yeah, so it becomes
it's taxed a lot less. So this is another thing we could do. We can raise capital gains. This is a big thing we could do, is raise capital gains rates to what ordinary income, the rates on ordinary income. Because right now it's a 17% difference.
Yeah, it's huge. Do you think it's possible to create a society or shift ours to a place where hoarding wealth is seen as the ultimate shame? I like that.
Wow. I mean, no.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, all those myths we talk about aren't myths about taking responsibility, or that the rich are gaming the system, or that, those stories don't have as much power.
I don't think the rich respond very much to shame.
Yeah.
In fact, they just sort of shut off.
Yeah.
I don't know that shaming is the way to do it.
Yeah.
You pass good policies, and that's really the only way to do it. But when very wealthy control the political process, it's very hard to pass those policies.
Well, that's like income inequality is not an epiphenomena. It's like the system was designed to create this.
I also don't think shame is really the right approach.
Yeah.
I mean, shame never really works. I mean, I do, maybe it does. I don't know.
Okay, here's the ultra.
I'm sorry, I didn't answer that very well.
That's okay. The ultra wealthy understand that they could end the suffering of many if they were willing to share. What is their justification for hoarding?
I've talked to people about the question of how much is enough, and the answer always seems to be it's just a little more than what you have. And sometimes people will say, "Oh, if I make 10 million or 20 million, I'm going to stop. That's enough." But they can't. It's like a drug.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think about these guys with billions, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. It's ludicrous.
Yeah.
I mean, what are you going to do? it is so, you're worth more than every country in the world almost,
Yeah.
you know? Why?
Yeah.
Like, why don't you quit?
Right.
Why don't you go do something else and give all your money away, or give half of it, or give whatever?
Yeah.
And it's all record keeping. Yeah. It's all, I want to prove how much of a man I am, and it's always a man. Almost always in those situations.
It is. There are 78 billionaires in San Francisco, one of the highest per capita. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to how this condition has or has not affected the policies and living standards in San Francisco for everyday citizens?
I cannot, because I don't follow San Francisco politics at all. I live in Oakland, so I apologize.
One's health is most strongly correlated with wealth in the United States. Can you speak to the effect of health to the 1% versus the 99%?
Yes. Well, in my book, I talk about concierge medicine. And I talked to a guy who runs a whole network of concierge doctors, and he told me about the experience. I didn't ever go to one myself, but it's essentially a primary care. You know, you have insurance outside of it for big disastrous things, but you go to this swank place, you're the only one there. There's no wait ever. The doctor addresses you by name. The person at the desk knows who you are, asks about your children, offers you coffee and croissants. And there's only, there's only anywhere from a couple hundred to like 25 patients. Most primary care, you're one of several thousand patients of your doctor. And so when there's something like the pandemic comes along, guess who gets the attention first? Yeah. So these concierge doctors went and sourced, COVID tests before anyone could get them. Who gets the shots first? The rich people get the shots first.
Yeah, in my case, my arthritis doctor basically became a concierge medical doctor, and so I'm kicked out.
Right.
But anyway,
and
yeah.
so, and so basically they charge you a chunk of money up per year for this service. And then, so it's sort of just this private primary care that's very upscale. Yeah. And so if not every 1%er partakes in that, but if you can certainly afford to, and if you do it, you're going to get a lot of personal attention from that doctor.
Yeah,
which, I was writing.
It's like to go to the doctor, because everybody else will be having a completely different experience than you.
Yeah. Well, I wrote the same thing about this as I did about these private schools I visited, which were just, they were wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, they had everything. They really...
Yeah, they had 32 electives.
Yeah, neurobiology in high school, Japanese and, Arabic and whatever you wanted at these schools. And they also had these admissions counselors that had worked, they were like, college counselors who had recently worked in college admissions at prestigious institutions, knew all the ways to get those kids in, and coached them through the whole process. The parents don't have to do anything, right? My kids went to a big urban public high school, and I sort of regret it because it was so hit and miss, but, and the college counseling was non-existent.
Oh, yeah.
I interviewed a college counselor there, and she said, I'm responsible for so many kids. Like, my time is all tied up with kids who are like just struggling to even get to school and go to school, let alone go to college, right? So the wealthier families at the school hire private services.
Yeah. What is the marriage premium?
Well, the marriage premium is, birds of a feather flock together, right? People tend to marry within their class. And so when you have a working households and the 1%ers marry 1%ers, or doctors marry doctors, lawyers marry lawyers, whatever, you are really increasing the earning potential of those families. Whereas you look at the statistics, so like 70% of high school dropouts marry high school dropouts. So it's the segregation of society into haves and have-nots. And if you are in this quintile, you're probably going to stay there. Yeah. And we're just talking about college education. These, what's called the Ivy Plus schools. So those are the most efficient mobility engines for if you are in the bottom quintile and you go to one of the Ivy Plus schools, which is the traditional Ivies plus, Stanford and Duke, there's a handful. Your chances of going from the bottom 20% to the top 20% are pretty high if you get through. But getting in is another matter. Yeah. And so here's a statistic in the book that I call shocking. Those schools have more students from the top 1% than the entire bottom 50%.
Yeah.
But half the population is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing.
So, there's something wrong with the process.
There is. Well, everything, like you said, where you have these vast differences in income inequality, it infects everything. So education, healthcare, our political systems.
Well, you're also talking about health. It's like, who gets saddled with the polluted areas, the industrial areas?
Right, exactly.
It's like the people who have no money,
Yeah.
right? In the very wealthy communities, the roads are good, the services are great, open spaces. It's just they're healthier places to be. There's less crime. The cost of crime in low-income communities is very high.
Yeah.
I mean, we hear about murders, right? But if somebody is shot, they probably have medical care their whole life on the basis of that. I mean, it's just. Yeah. Mother Jones once did a thing about the cost of gun violence, and it's astounding. The people who are injured, the costs are unbelievable. And we don't think about the injured, we only think about the dead, right?
Yeah. Well, so here we are. Since 1980, there's been increases in income inequality and wealth inequality year on year. We did have the Occupy Wall Street movement. We heard about the top 1%, the other 99%. Is there a time in the future where we can see the beginning of the reversal of this trend? Because it's getting worse and worse without relenting, regardless of the pandemic or what wars we're engaged in. Are there signs that we might be able to make progress on this as an issue?
At the end of the book, I was torn, right? Because this was right at a time when the George Floyd protests had happened. There was this whole, corporations were talking about increasing diversity in their ranks, and the word woke was not a bad word.
Yeah.
It was a good word.
Right.
With the Republicans quickly turned it into a bad word, into a slur.
Right.
Right. In remarkably short time, they just demonized it. I mean, woke was just a word, a long-standing word in the Black community for being aware of the way the society is rigged, essentially.
Yeah.
And Trump walks in and saying, hey, it's rigged, but it's rigged in favor of him.
Yeah.
And that's what he doesn't talk about. He claims to be a victim, right? No.
Yeah.
Talk about two-tier system of justice. Yeah, you're the top tier, pal. The top tier.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But yeah, so one thing that does help is just being aware of the problem, and I do hope that we can make progress on this because it's undermining our democracy.
I hope so too.
That Thomas Piketty book, it was one of the most powerful books. I read it right when it was published.
Yeah, so this was a bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century, exactly. A very wonky book, right?
Yeah, I loved it.
And that showed how much people suddenly got interested in that. Yeah. But that was a certain segment of people, right? Like I said, the general public.
Yeah,
still believe in the mobility optimism, right?
Yeah, so true.
So I was going to say that in the end, so there were all these hopeful signs. Okay, people are waking up, and we have a Democratic trifecta, and the Democrats tend to be more pro. And they've been talking about raising taxes on the rich and so forth. Well, they barely had the Senate, couldn't get it through.
Yeah,
couldn't get. I mean, they did some good policies, but they couldn't get a lot of it through.
Yeah.
And that frustrated people who were looking for something. Oh, well, let me just tell you about something that I've written about since this book. It wasn't in the book. But I learned a lot about retirement savings.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just the most boring subject. But retirement savings, do you know that it's the federal government's biggest tax expenditure by far than any other tax break is subsidizing retirement. $2.5 trillion over 5 years from 23 to 27. $2.5 trillion.
Yeah.
And almost all of that money goes to the top 10%.
Yeah.
Half of America doesn't have a retirement account.
Yeah,
they don't have a retirement account. And the very, very wealthy are just shoving the money in there. It grows for tax-free forever.
Oh my gosh.
And they've also worked it, Peter Thiel worked it, so he's got a $5 billion Roth IRA.
Oh my gosh.
And that is supposed to be a middle-class savings vehicle.
Yeah. I didn't even get a chance to answer. I mean, it's amazing that we ran out of time, and we've run over, so I thank you for sticking with me. But and I didn't even get a chance to ask my biggest question, which was just like, how can Grace Cathedral benefit from these philanthropists? We have 78 billionaires in San Francisco. Why are we barely able to keep the lights on?
Praise them effusively.
Exactly. Maybe that's the answer. Please join me next week when my guest will be Canon Stephanie Spellers. We'll be talking about who we are, why God placed us here, and what the Episcopal Church will look like over the next 50 years. Canon Stephanie is also preaching at the 11 o'clock Eucharist. You're always welcome to join us upstairs for the choral Eucharist at 11 o'clock a.m. I definitely encourage you to buy a copy of Jackpot. It's available at the table and back. And we rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. Michael, it's been such a blessing for me to be able to spend this time with your book and your ideas, and I look forward to what you work on in the future. I'm looking forward to reading about retirement accounts.
Really?
Yeah, I am. Well, I mean, I guess I was the person who read Capital. I didn't think it was for wonky people. I just enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, this book is not wonky.
No, it isn't at all. This book is really for everyone. I mean, I guess that's what I was saying about Capital, is that there's a way in which those ideas will have new life, and part of that is by reading them in a way that's accessible to people. Right. And I feel like your book is that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so good to have you.
Good to be here.
Yeah.